The Greek cities. The Greek cities that were really states. We modern people love the sound of the word big. We pride ourselves upon the fact that we belong to the biggest country in the world and possess the biggest navy and grow the biggest oranges and potatoes. And we love to live in cities of millions of inhabitants, and when we are dead, we're buried in the biggest cemetery of the whole state. A citizen of ancient Greece, could he have heard us talk, would not have known what we meant. Moderation in all things was the ideal of his life, and mere bulk did not impress him at all. And this love of moderation was not merely a hollow phrase used upon special occasions. It influenced the life of the Greeks from the day of their birth to the hour of their death. It was part of their literature, and it made them build small but perfect temples, found expression in the clothes which the men wore, and in the rings and the bracelets of their wives. It followed the crowds that went to the theater, and made them hoot down at any playwright who dared to sin against the iron law of good taste or good sense. The Greeks even insisted upon their quantity in their politicians and in their most popular athletes. When a powerful runner came to Sparta and boasted that he could stand longer on one foot than any other man in Hellas, the people drove him from the city because he prided himself upon an accomplishment in which he could be beaten by any common goose. That is all very well, you will say, and no doubt it is a great virtue to care so much for moderation and perfection. But why should the Greeks have been the only people to develop this quality in olden times? For an answer, I shall point to the way in which the Greeks lived. The people of Egypt or Mesopotamia had been the subjects of a mysterious supreme ruler who lived miles and miles away in a dark palace, and who was rarely seen by the masses of the population. The Greeks, on the other hand, were free citizens of 100 independent little cities, the largest of which counted fewer inhabitants than a large modern village. When a peasant who lived in said that he was a Babylonian, he meant that he was one of the millions of other people who paid tribute to the king, and who at that particular moment happened to be master of Western Asia. But when a Greek said proudly that he was an Athenian or a Theban, he spoke of a small town which was both his home and his country, which recognized no master but the will of the people in the marketplace. To the Greek, his fatherland was the place where he was born, where he had spent his earliest years playing hide-and-seek amidst the forbidden rocks of Archopolis, where he had grown into manhood with 1,000 other boys and girls, whose nicknames were as familiar to him as those of your own schoolmates. His fatherland was the holy soil where his father and mother lay buried. It was the small house within the high city walls where his wife and children lived in safety. It was a complete world which covered no more than 4 or 5 acres of rocky land. Don't you see how these surroundings must have influenced a man in everything he did and said and thought? The people of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt had been part of a vast mob. They had been lost in the multitude. The Greeks, on the other hand, had never lost touch with his immediate surroundings. He never ceased to be part of a little town where everybody knew everyone else. He felt that his intelligent neighbors were watching him. Whatever he did, whether he wrote plays or made statues out of marble or composed songs, he remembered that his efforts were going to be judged by the free-born citizens of his hometown who knew about such things. This knowledge forced him to strive after perfection, and perfection, he had been taught from childhood, was not possible without moderation. In this hard school, the Greeks learned to excel in many things. They created new forms of government and new forms of literature, and new ideals in art which we had never been able to surpass. They performed these miracles in little villages that covered less ground than 4 or 5 modern city blocks. And look what finally happened. In the 4th century before our era, Alexander of Macedonia conquered the world. As soon as he had done with fighting, Alexander decided that he must bestow the benefits of a true Greek genius upon all mankind. He took it away from the little cities and the little villages, and tried to make it blossom and bear fruit amidst the vast royal residencies of his newly acquired empire. But the Greeks removed from the familiar sight of their own temples, removed from the well-known surrounds and smells of their own crooked streets, at once lost the cheerful joy and the marvelous sense of moderation which had inspired the work of her hands and brains while they labored for the glory of their old city-states. They became cheap artisans content with second-rate work. The day the little city-states of old Hellas lost their independence and were forced to become part of a big nation, the old Greek spirit died, and it has been dead ever since. Greek self-government. The Greeks were the first people to try the difficult experiment of self-government. In the beginning, all the Greeks had been equally rich and equally poor. Every man had owned a certain number of cows and sheep. His mud hut had been his castle. He had been free to come and go as he wished. Whenever it was necessary to discuss matters of public importance, all the citizens had gathered in the marketplace. One of the older men of the village was elected chairman, and it was his duty to see that everybody had a chance to express his views. In case of war, a particularly energetic and self-confident villager was chosen commander-in-chief, but the same people who had voluntarily given this man the right to be their leader claimed an equal right to deprive him of his job once the danger had been averted. But gradually, the village had grown into a city. Some people had worked hard, and others had been lazy. A few had been unlucky, and still others had been just plain dishonest in dealing with their neighbors, and had gathered wealth. As a result, the city no longer consisted of a number of men who were equally well off. On the contrary, it was inhabited by a small class of very rich people, and a large class of very poor ones. There had been another change. The old commander-in-chief, who had been willingly recognized as headsman or king, because he knew how to lead his men to victory, had disappeared from the scene. His place had been taken by the nobles, a class of rich people who during the course of time had gotten a hold of undue share of the farms and estates. These nobles enjoyed many advantages over the common crowd of freemen. They were able to buy the best weapons which were to be found on the market of the eastern Mediterranean. They had much spare time in which they could practice the art of fighting. They lived in strongly built houses, and they could hire soldiers to fight for them. They were constantly quarreling amongst each other to decide who should rule the city. The victorious nobleman then assumed a sort of kingship over all his neighbors and governed the town until he in turn was killed or driven away by still another ambitious nobleman. Such a king by the grace of his soldiers was called a tyrant, and during the 7th and 6th centuries before our era, every Greek city was for a time ruled by such tyrants, many of whom by the way happened to be exceedingly capable men. In the long run, the state of affairs became unbearable. Then attempts were made to bring about reforms, and out of these reforms grew the first democratic government of which the world has a record. It was early in the 7th century that the people of Athens decided to do some house cleaning and give a large number of freemen once more a voice in the government as they were supposed to have had in the days of their archaic ancestors. They asked a man by the name of Draco to provide them with a set of laws that would protect the poor against the aggressions of the rich. Draco set to work. Unfortunately, he was a professional lawyer, and very much out of touch with ordinary life. In his eyes, a crime was a crime, and when he had finished his code, the people of Athens discovered that these draconian laws were so severe that they could not possibly be put into effect. There would not have been rope enough to hang all the criminals under their new system of jurisprudence, which made the stealing of an apple a capital offense. The Athenians looked about for a more humane reformer. At last they found someone who could do that sort of thing better than anyone else. His name was Solon. He belonged to a noble family. He had traveled all over the world and had studied the forms of government of many other countries. After a careful study of the subject, Solon gave Athens a set of laws which bore testimony to that wonderful principle of moderation which was part of the Greek character. He tried to improve the condition of the peasant without, however, destroying the prosperity of the nobles, who were, or rather could be, of such great service to the state as soldiers. To protect the poorer class against abuse on the part of the judges, who were always elected from the class of the nobles because they received no salary, Solon made a provision whereby a citizen with a grievance had the right to state his case before a jury of 30 of his fellow Athenians. Most important of all, Solon forced the average freeman to make a direct and personal interest in the affairs of the city. No longer could he stay at home and say, "Oh, I'm too busy a day," or "It is raining and I had better stay indoors." He was expected to do his share, to be at the meeting of the town council, and carry part of the responsibility for the safety and prosperity of the state. This government by the demos, the people, who was often far more successful, there was too much idle talk. There were too many hateful and spiteful scenes between rivals for official honor. But it taught the Greek people to be independent and rely upon themselves for their salvation, and that was a very good thing. Greek life, how the Greeks lived. But how, you will ask, did the ancient Greeks have time to look after their families and their business if they were forever running to the marketplace to discuss affairs of state? In this chapter I shall tell you. In all matters of government, the Greek democracy recognized only one class of citizen, the freeman. Every Greek city was composed of a small number of freeborn citizens, a large number of slaves and sprinkling of foreigners. At rare intervals, usually during a war, when men were needed for the army, the Greeks showed themselves willing to confer the rights of citizenship upon the barbarians, as they called the foreigners. But this was an exception. Citizenship was a matter of birth. You were an Athenian because your father and your grandfather had been Athenians before you. But however great your merits as a trader or a soldier, if you were born of non-Athenian parents, you remain a foreigner until the end of time. The Greek city, therefore, whenever it was not ruled by a king or a tyrant, was run by and for the freemen. And this would not have been possible without a large army of slaves who outnumbered the free citizens at the rate of 6 or 5 to 1, and who performed those tasks to which we modern people must devote most of our time and energy if we wish to provide for our families and pay the rent of our apartments. The slaves did all the cooking and baking and candlestick making of the entire city. They were the tailors and the carpenters and the jewelers and the school teachers and the bookkeepers, and they tended the store, and they looked after the factory while the master went to the public meeting to discuss questions of war and peace, or visited theater to see the latest play of Euclides, or hear a discussion of revolutionary ideas of Eurydice, who had dared to express certain doubts upon the omnipotence of the great god Zeus. Indeed, ancient Athens resembled a modern club. All the freeborn citizens were hereditary members, and all the slaves were hereditary servants, and waited upon the needs of their masters. It was very pleasant to be a member of the organization. But when we talk about our slaves, we do not mean the sort of people about you have read in the pages of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is true that the position of those slaves who tilled the fields was a very unpleasant one, but the average freeman who had come down in the world and who had been obliged to hire himself out as a farmhand led just as a miserable life. In the cities, furthermore, many of the slaves were more prosperous than the poorer class of the freemen, for the Greeks, who loved moderation in all things, did not like to treat their slaves after the fashion which afterward was so common in Rome, where a slave had as few rights as an engine in a modern factory and could be thrown to the wild animals upon the smallest pretext. The Greeks accepted slavery as a necessary institution, without which no city could possibly become the home of a truly civilized people. The slaves also took care of those tasks which nowadays are performed by the businessmen and the professional men. As for those household duties which take up so much of the time of your mother, and which worry your father when he comes home from his office, the Greeks, who understood the value of leisure, had reduced such duties to the smallest possible minimum by living amidst surroundings of extreme simplicity. To begin with, their homes were very plain. Even the rich nobles spent their lives in a sort of abode barn, which lacked all the comforts which a modern workman expects as his natural right. A Greek home consisted of 4 walls and a roof. There was a door which led into the street, and there were no windows. The kitchen, the living rooms, and the sleeping quarters were built around an open courtyard, in which there was a small fountain or a statue and a few plants to make it look bright. Within this courtyard the family lived, when it did not rain or when it was not too cold. In one corner of the yard the cook, who was a slave, prepared the meal, and in another corner the teacher, who was also a slave, taught the children the alpha, beta, gamma, and the tables of multiplication, and in still another corner, the lady of the house, who rarely left her domain, since it was not considered good form for a married woman to be seen on the street too often, was repairing her husband's coat with her seamstress, who were slaves. And in the little office, right off a door, the master was inspecting the accounts, which the overseer of his farm, who was a slave, had just brought to him. When dinner was ready, the family came together, but the meal was a very simple one, and did not take much time. The Greeks seem to have regarded eating as an unavoidable evil, and not a pastime, which kills many dreary hours and eventually kills many dreary people. They lived on bread and on wine, with a little meat and some green vegetables. They drink water only when nothing else is available because they did not think it very healthy. They loved to call on each other for dinner, but our idea of a festive meal where everybody is supposed to eat much more than is good for him would have disgusted them. They came together at the table for the purpose of good talk and a good glass of wine and water, but as they were moderate people, they despised those who drank too much. The same simplicity which prevailed in the dining room also dominated their choice of clothes. They liked to be clean and well groomed, to have their hair and beards neatly cut, to feel their bodies strong with the exercise and the swimming of a gymnasium, but they never followed the Asiatic fashion which prescribed loud colors and strange patterns. They wore a long white coat, and they managed to look as smart as a modern Italian officer in his long blue cape. They loved to see their wives wear ornaments, but they thought it very vulgar to display their wealth or their wives in public, and whenever the women left their home, they were as inconspicuous as possible. In short, the story of the Greek life is a story not only of moderation, but also of simplicity. Things, chairs and tables and books and houses and carriages are apt to take up a great deal of their own owner's time. In the end, they invariably make him their slave, and his hours are spent looking after their wants, keeping them polished and brushed and painted. The Greeks before everything else wanted to be free, both in mind and in body. That they might maintain their liberty and be truly free in spirit, they reduced their daily needs to their lowest possible point. The Greek theater. The origins of the theater, the first form of public amusement. At a very early stage of their history, the Greeks had begun to collect the poems which had been written in honor of their brave ancestors who had driven the Pelagians out of Hellas and destroyed the power of Troy. These poems were recited in public, and everybody came to listen to them. But the theater, the form of entertainment which has become almost a necessary part of our own lives, did not grow out of these recited heroic tales. It had such a curious origin that I must tell you something about it in a separate chapter. The Greeks had always been fond of parades. Every year they held solemn processions in honor of Dionysus, the god of the wine. As everybody in Greece drank wine, the Greeks thought water only useful for the purpose of swimming and sailing. This particular divinity was as popular as a god of the soda fountain would be in our own land. Because the wine god was supposed to live in the vineyards amidst a merry rout of satyrs, strange creatures who were half men and half goat. The crowd that joined the procession used to wear goat skins and to hee-haw like real billy goats. The Greek word for a goat is tragos, and the Greek word for a singer is oidos. The singer who made like a goat therefore was called a tragos oidos, or a goat singer. And it is this strange name which developed into the modern word tragedy, which means in the theatrical sense a piece with an unhappy ending, just as comedy, which really means the singing of something commos or gay in the name given to a play which ends happily. But how, you will ask, did this noisy chorus of masqueraders stamping around like wild goats ever develop into the noble tragedies which have filled the theaters of the world for almost 2,000 years? The connecting link between the goat singer and Hamlet is really very simple, as I shall show you in a moment. The singing chorus was very amusing in the beginning, and attracted large crowds of spectators who stood along the side of the road and laughed. But soon this business of tree-hawing grew tiresome, and the Greeks through dullness and evil only comparable to ugliness or sickness. They asked for something more entertaining. Then an inventive young poet from the village of Icera in the Attica hit upon a new idea which proved a tremendous success. He made one of the members of the goat chorus step forward and engage in conversation with the leader of the musicians who march at the head of the parade, playing upon their pipes of Pan. This individual was allowed to step out of line. He waved his arms and gestically while he spoke, that is to say, he acted while the others merely stood by and sang, and he asked a lot of questions which the bandmaster answered according to the roll of the papyrus upon which the poet had written down these answers before the show began. This rough and ready conversation, the dialogue which told the story of Dionysus, or one of the other gods, became at once popular with the crowd. Henceforth, every Dionysian procession had an acted scene, and very soon the acting was considered more important than the procession and a maiming. Euclid, the most successful of all tragedians, who wrote no less than 80 plays during his long life, made a bold step forward when he introduced 2 actors instead of 1. A generation later, Sophocles increased the number of actors to 3. When Eurydice began to write his terrible tragedies in the middle of the 5th century BC, he was allowed as many actors as he liked. And when Aristophanes wrote those famous comedies in which he poked fun at everybody and everything, including the gods of Mount Olympus, the chorus had been reduced to the role of the mere bystanders who were lined up behind the principal performers and who sang "This is a Terrible World," while the hero in the foreground committed a crime against the will of the gods. The new form of dramatic entertainment demanded a proper setting, and soon every Greek city owned a theater cut out of a rock of a nearby hill. The spectators sat upon wooden benches and faced a wide circle, our present orchestra, where you pay $3.30 for a seat. Upon this half circle, which was the stage, the actors in the chorus took their stand. Behind them, there was a tent, where they made up with large clay masks, which hid their faces and which showed the spectators whether the actors were supposed to be happy and smiling, or unhappy and weeping. The Greek word for tent is skene, and that is the reason why we talk of the scenery of the stage. Once the tragedy had become part of Greek life, the people took it very seriously and never went to the theater to give their minds a vacation. A new play became an important event as an election, and a successful playwright was received with greater honors than those bestowed upon a general who had just returned from a famous victory.